Hi, I'm Ed Legaspi. I'm a senior Java developer, currently an advocate at AWS Serverless. Today I'm gonna show you how to configure multi-tenancy in Keycloak with Spring API Gateway integration. Let me start by asking these questions. Are you building an application that uses the microservice architecture? Are you using a Spring API Gateway for flexible routing and managing common security, resilience, and monitoring? Does your application need to support multi-tenancy, where you have a single application that is used by multiple clients? Are you using Keycloak to secure your services? If you answer yes to all these questions, then this tutorial is for you. In this diagram, let's imagine a billing platform, and here are the user and wallet services. Let me present a sequence diagram to see how it works. To make it simple, we will not make a request from the user to the wallet service. We will begin with the client. The client will send a request to the user info in our API gateway. The API gateway will verify the issuer information from our Keycloak server, and only when it's verified will it route the request to the user info in our user service. The user service will check whether the currently logged user sending the request is authorized to actually perform or call the API from the Keycloak server. The Keycloak server will respond with authorized, and only then will it return with a response to our API gateway and eventually to the client. There are two technical questions that we need to answer. 1. How are we going to validate the issuer in the Spring API gateway? And 2. How are we going to forward the bearer token from the Spring API gateway to the user service? Before we proceed, let's discuss the components that we have in our architecture diagram. Keycloak is an open source identity and access management platform. It provides out-of-the-box features such as authentication and authorization. For this exercise, we will use a custom Keycloak server from GitHub at CZETSUYATECH CT Keycloak IAM. This project downloads a specific version of Keycloak server and builds customizations such as theme, provider, and realm. We will need two tenants to demonstrate multi-tenancy, and thus, we will create two Keycloak realms. I already prepared two realms that we can import. Let's run the Keycloak server. Once done, go back to your browser and open the URL localhost port 8080. The default username and password for the admin user is keycloak.admin. And from here, we can import the realm files from CT multi-tenant Keycloak Spring project. Hover on the CZETSUYATECH realm, which is a default realm created when we run the customized Keycloak server. Click Add and select a file, tenant1. Make sure that you have the web front and backend services clients because we will use them later. Now let's do the same with tenant2. Click Add Realm and find the tenant2 Keycloak configuration file. Click Create. We now have the two Keycloak realms imported in our server. We will create the user service project in Spring using IntelliJ IDE. Add a new user controller and endpoint that returns the user information. This project needs the following dependencies: Keycloak Spring Boot Starter and Spring Boot Starter Security. These dependencies will be used to define the security configuration and config resolver using a header parameter. Don't forget to add the Keycloak configuration. Once done, open Postman and start sending the requests. I have already created the project, so I will just show you the content and let's see how it works. Let's open the user controller. This is a REST controller with a single endpoint. Get method for user info. What it does is it will read the bearer token and get the Keycloak principal, and then it will return the first name, family name, and subject ID of the currently login user. Next is the header-based config resolver. Every time we send a request to our endpoint in the user controller, it will pass through this code. And what it does is it will get the value of the Keycloak from header parameter. For example, if the value is tenant1, it will read the file tenant1-keycloak.json in our resources folder. These two files are actually Keycloak configurations. So this is for tenant1 and this is for tenant2. Both are using the resource backend services. Once it loads the file, it will then build the Keycloak deployment and it will add it to the cache so that the next time we call our endpoint, it will not load the file and rebuild the Keycloak deployment. Let's run this application and send some requests using Postman. Now it's time to create the API Gateway project. We need to add the following dependencies: Spring Cloud Starter Gateway, Spring Boot Starter Auth Client, and Spring Boot Starter Web Flux. And then we need to add the gateway configuration, where we will define the routing information that will route the request to the user service. And finally, we need to set the Authentication Manager resolver in the security web filter chain. Once again, I have already prepared the project, so I will just show you the content and let's see how it works. This is my gateway and this is the configuration. In this configuration, we are telling the Spring API Gateway that any request with users in its path will be routed to localhost port 8001. And remember, we have the user service running on this address, and it will forward the bearer token using the token relay gateway filter factory. Now this is important. We need to set the Authentication Manager resolver in the security web filter chain, and the value of this Authentication Manager resolver are the trusted issuers from our two tenants. So remember we have tenant 1 and tenant 2. Later I will show you what will happen if we remove one of this value. So now let's try running our gateway application. I will clean the log on user application so that we can see or we can verify that when we call the gateway application, it's actually calling the user service as well. So let's clear it and let's clear this one as well. Let's go back to Postman, and once again, I have already prepared the two requests that we can use to send or to call the user info from the API gateway. So this one is calling the user info from port 8000, and API gateway is running on that port. So let's try calling this endpoint. Oh, it should not work. Yeah, because I'm using the access token from tenant 2. So once again, let's generate a new access token for tenant 1 and paste it in our bearer token. Once we have it, we should be able to call the get tenant 1 from the API gateway, and we should be able to get the user Kerry Legaspi. Let's observe the log. The API gateway received the request with path users user info, and it is routed to the user service, as we can see here. Get user info. Now let's try for the tenant 2. So once again, let's generate a new access token for tenant 2 user 2. Open the get tenant to, and let's send the request to the API gateway. Here we have the user Ed Legaspi, which is the user 2 from tenant 2. Once again, we can check that we have received the log, and here they are for both gateway and the user service. Now, as I was saying earlier, what will happen if we remove this value? And let's restart the gateway application. Can you guess what will happen? So remember in our previous diagram, I was showing the sequence diagram that when we send a request to the API gateway, it will validate the issuer information from the Keycloak server. But now we have removed that URL. So that means that there's no way for the API gateway to validate the issuer information. So if we send the request for tenant 2, we should be able to get 401 authorized because it's not able to validate the request. And let's make sure that we are not calling the user service if that is the case. We have cleaned the logs and hit the send button. So in gateway, there is no log, meaning it didn't reach the routing code because it was blocked. And in the user service, there is no log as well, meaning it didn't reach the user service. Thanks for joining me in this brief demonstration. I hope it helps you with your project. If you have any questions, you can always ask in the comment section of this video. Once again, this is Ed, and happy coding!